All right, Kirk Kanzelberger, faculty fellow. Thank you for joining me for this interview. Um, I'm not sure. One thing I've been sort of thinking about is how long I've known each faculty member of the Lyceum, and I can't recall exactly when it was we met. I know it was through LinkedIn of all avenues. How long have we known each other at this point? Do you know?
Oh, I mean, that must have been 7 years ago.
7 years?
Eight?
Oh, yeah, yeah. How time flies, right?
Whatever the number is, it's bigger than we think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and it's always more than just a number too. Um, to start off, the question I'm beginning each of these interviews with, because I think it's an interesting point for getting to know someone and getting to know about someone and about how people come to this rather unusual, avenue for living. What is it that drew you into the intellectual life in the first place, or what were the stages that drew you to pursuit of an intellectual manner of living?
Well, I can't like I can't point to a moment of discovery or even a particular single stage of life. It even sounds to me odd to speak of an intellectual life or the intellectual life because for me it just simply grew out of living. It grew out of what happened to me, particularly in I would say the first 17 years of my life before, up until the time I went to college. So I can think of contributing factors, experiences, early literacy. My dad taught me to read when I was 3 years old. I don't remember being a non-reader. I'm not sure why he did that. I was the youngest of his four children, and he must have thought I seemed interested, I suppose. I remember that when I was 5 years old, he gave me a challenge. The challenge was to read The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. It was 1967, if I have the year right. The film was coming out with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And he said, Kirk, if you read this play from beginning to end, you can go with mom and I to the theater and see the film with us. I don't know that I'd been in a movie theater before. So I read the play and I went with them to the theater. And 10 minutes into the film, I fell asleep because it was past my bedtime. I woke up for Kate's last speech to the other women. But I remember that the feeling of disappointment in myself was like, I worked so hard for this. And I fell asleep. But, the early literacy brought me into contact with ideas. Of course, you have to be able to receive those ideas. And in some way, as my reception of various kinds of signs in my life. So literary signs, works of literature, works of that kind of art are deliberately constructed to lead us beyond the immediacy of life. And well, the next year I turned 6 and my dad died suddenly in the middle of the night. And that ushered me across some kind of threshold because my my memory kind of becomes a continuous thread from that night on. And there are external evidence that I was starting to think about life itself and its meaning. Even in the days and weeks following the funeral, there's evidence of that. And ever since then, the idea that death entered not only my consciousness but my self-consciousness. Maybe that was the dawn of my self-consciousness, whatever that exactly means. But for sure, the thought of my own death has been right here ever since. It's never far from me. About the same, I mean, when I was 7 years old, I think I had an encounter with music that touched me deeply. there was a recording of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Toscanini with the NBC Symphony, that that affected me deeply. I was 7 or 8 years old, but I felt, and I've been reading. One of the things I've been reading recently is this book by a Benedictine, Elizabeth Labat, on the mystery of music. It's very, very profound work. But so I'm gonna borrow some of her words here. But even at that age, I felt this intoxication and the sense of being wounded at the same time. An intoxicating wound that is through this sign of the sound, you are touched by a less material form as well, which turns out to itself be a sign of an unlimited beauty, which awakens this nostalgia, this longing. Some would say a longing for an earthly paradise that's been lost, but I think, though that could be maybe a secondary element, there's something becomes present that is yet at the same time remote. Like you feel like it's there beyond the veil of the music. You can't reach it, you can't embrace it, it's not within your power, but you're intoxicated by this touch, and it's touching you. So music became, at that point, very important. I became a flutist beginning in 6th grade. And I was going, for a long time, I was going to pursue that as a career. I was intending to major in flute performance at the University of Wisconsin, probably. And in the last year of high school, I made this sudden pivot to science and math. But I now just jumped all the way to age 17. All right. Other things that happened to me were, a lot of adversity, dysfunction, uprootedness. I went to 9 schools in 12 years. One of the schools I went to was in Madrid, Spain, where we just kind of went and spent a couple of years. These were ages 9 to 11. That was an encounter with a different culture. And there I came into contact with other signs. In particular, I had a beloved teacher at that school that introduced me to the works of Tolkien, who at that time was still alive. And obviously, the Jackson films were far in the future. In fact, Peter Jackson and I are the same age. We're like 1 week apart. So he was in knee pants too. All right, but I read The Lord of the Rings, and it gave me a vision of the moral life that I was not getting anywhere else. There are goods that are greater than ourselves, that are worth sacrifice. And I became immersed in this world, and it was a kind of whole moral education in a way, but also something very important. And there's so many things I could say about that work and what it has meant to me through my whole life. But the temptation of the ring.
Yeah, just to interject for a moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. I don't want to go on at any great length about it, but I too suffered a death in the family when I was quite young. My eldest brother died when I was 5, very suddenly, in a car crash, and the way that sort of at a very young age you encounter this sudden break, this disconnect that does draw you into questioning about, what does it all mean? Right? What is it all about?
Yeah.
Why do we live? Why do we go through these things? You're not really conscious. You can't really articulate those questions.
Yes.
But you used the phrase earlier that it's almost as though life became a continuous thread from that moment. And I would say that's powerfully resonant imagery right there. And so too, just thinking about music and literature, and something like the literature of Tolkien, who has this whole world that he constructs, this whole continuous sort of construction, right, where everything's connected to everything else. That's one of the things I always found fascinating about the literature of Tolkien quite young, is the way that the narratives connected between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings even. I was always fascinated at the connection between those two different works.
Hmm.
that are part of one thing, which is one in the whole, one in the same whole. Um, so I think this is, I mean, just to sort of recapitulate a little bit, seeing these signs of meaning, right? Even in the things that are perhaps very disruptive, and damaging to us. I think that's a very it's an interesting point to see where you and I having such similar interests as we do, that there's perhaps some similar reasons why.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
didn't want to disrupt you too much there, but I
Yeah.
think it's very interesting just to
Yeah.
sort of see these points.
I did want to say one more thing about Tolkien, which is
Sure.
the temptation of the ring, which I think I grasped even when I was reading it at 10 years old, at 11 years old, is that it's not all up to us. We're not in charge of good and evil. It's not up to us through our own efforts and our own powers to make everything right. It could be a subtle temptation, and we may not realize that we're kind of putting ourselves in charge of good and evil. But something that comes through in the tale is that human beings, the finite moral agents, play a part, but that there is a power and a providence that is whose purposes we don't grasp fully. And in short, we need something like grace, and to not simply try to take matters into our own hands in this kind of absolute way, which I think is part of the temptation of the ring, if not the central feature of it. Now, Brian, I know you love the study of mathematics. It's one of your great loves. You've told me how much you love math. Now, I know that's not exactly true,
I
but
love it in theory. I'll put it that way.
all right. Well, I mentioned the sudden pivot I made to math and science. I had been going to study music, and I can't explain fully why I made that pivot, but that's another kind of sign, the mathematical sign. That's application to the study of the being that changes, as Aristotle would call it. He would call it physics, and we still use the term physics as the study of that being, even though it's been mathematized and in a way narrowed in our time. But I went to Caltech when I was 17, and also at the same time made the decision to enter the Catholic Church. So there's more going on in me than just a sudden attraction to math and science. After graduation, I went to work in the tech industry. The tech boom was accelerating in Silicon Valley, and I got kind of swept up in it through people that I knew, and it turned into a whole career, alongside of which I began graduate studies in philosophy and theology. So that's kind of the question you asked is what drew me into the intellectual life. Again, I think it was the encounter with these signs. I don't see it as something that, I think I'll choose an intellectual life. It was a development of my being, in which the things that I encountered, that I went through, aroused this kind of thirst to ask and ponder these questions of the meaning of things, stretching beyond simply the temporal flow of life in the direction of its source, of the one that's in and behind the many, the ultimate beauty, the ultimate form, that which gives form and being to things and governs them. And this is intellectual life. The fact is, each one of us has intellect. We have this power of understanding, of moving beyond simply the immediate flow of conscious life and the immediate implications of things. So that's my answer to your question. That intellectual life is simply a development of life itself, and I think it's something that everyone can attempt. Um, and that's why we have the Lyceum Institute, to help people pursue that kind of development of their understanding.
Yeah. So, you've been talking about this a lot in terms of signs, that it's almost as though one sign after another just pointed you in the direction that you've gone, right? Through the interpretation of these signs, which brings me to my next question that you and I mentioned before, shared interests, and in particular is the field or the method or the approach, people dispute what exactly it is, of semiotics, which we can define as the study of the action of signs most succinctly. But you've also have this background in perhaps a bit more of a little bit more of a traditional approach to philosophy in Thomism. So, how do you see these two developments, right? The Thomistic background in philosophy that you have, and the semiotic interest that has motivated you. How do you see these two intersecting? Where do they overlap? How do they come together? What thoughts do you have there?
Well, I got into this business of semiotics unexpectedly in the course of trying to think about a problem from a Thomistic standpoint. So after I graduated from Caltech and started my tech career, I was studying Thomism with the Dominican friars of the Western Province out in Berkeley, California, and I owe so much to those guys. I came to consider when I was doing my doctoral work at Fordham University was in moral psychology. And here again, you see how the intellectual life grows out of life itself, because I had thought to do my doctoral work on evolution and God as formal and final cause, kind of relating to my background in math and biology and the sciences. But I ended up getting snagged by this other concern, which really just related to kind of, again, rereading my life and trying to interpret my own experience of evil, of human dysfunction, bad choices, both my own and other people's. I was fascinated by works of moral psychology written by people like C.S. Lewis, like the Screw Tape Letters and The Great Divorce. Like, what is it in us that we are, what are we doing when we choose something that is going to take us away from our true happiness, which is what happens when we choose something bad, when we choose evil, which we can evidently do knowingly. And so this was how I got into semiotics, because I was thinking about the state of cognition of the one who makes a bad choice. It was my effort to understand that I ended up realizing that I was, well, being told by my dissertation director that I was actually reinventing some key conceptions of semiotics, because I was beginning to perceive how our conscious life and our deliberations over what to do, and how our reasoning about how we're going to be happy, in short, our entire conscious life, is a kind of weave of an interpretation of signs. And we are able to begin to tell ourselves little stories about what we need, about the only thing that can make us happy. And within that interpretive context, this thing that we're considering doing can appear not only as something that we can do, but something we must do. even though everyone in our lives might tell us you're going down the wrong road. And so I guess without fully realizing it, I stepped across a threshold there which didn't supplant anything at all that I'd learned in the more traditional study of Thomism, or Aristotle, or the ancients, the medievals, but rather it was a new light. And even that tradition of which we speak had been making significant advances in the consideration of signs and of the conscious life of living beings as an action of signs. Even the Thomistic tradition of which we speak had been making headway there at the very time that that tradition went into eclipse, at the time of Descartes. So you and I know that history pretty well. So there's a thread of continuity there, what we call semiotics, really back to the traditions that we've studied, and even back to the very origins of philosophy. Philosophy has always been, from its very beginnings in the West, been concerned with both understanding reality. By reality, I mean that which is what it is, independent of what you or I think, believe, or feel. And also understanding how the heck it is that we can have that sort of understanding. And what is understanding anyway? Now, I mean, you and I, as semioticians, at least think we see pretty clearly that it is this reality of the sign, which is not so much a kind of thing as it is a kind of relationship that obtains, a kind of relationship that is evidently part of the architecture of things, but which has been steadily overlooked, not thematized, misconstrued. There are traditions of philosophy which even make its construal all but impossible, and one of those is the modern tradition. Unfortunately, the history of modernity in philosophy has largely been a story of how, on the one hand, the human intellect is apparently liberated to understand reality for real through the methods of science, while on the other side, on that other question of how we can actually understand anything of reality, philosophers have progressively been despairing of that, have not known how to account for it. This correspondence, or this union, or this nexus between mind and world. Semiotics, whatever it is, is it a field, a method, it is really, in a certain sense, it's not a narrow study at all, because
No.
it seems that there is no mode of human knowing that is not owing to the action of signs. And it should be said that a sign doesn't simply act on us. It's not an action of a compulsive type. There is a kind of compulsion in it when something affects your senses and you can't help that. But the action of a sign depends upon the receiver. I have to be able to... What does any sign do? A sign manifests or intimates or moves you into an awareness of something that the sign itself is not. So it moves you to the awareness of something more. But there's a kind of twofold relativity there. A sign is relative to what it is able to disclose, which is something beyond just the immediacy of whatever is affecting your senses. The sign is relative to what it can disclose, but it's also relative to the one to whom it will be disclosed. You have to be able to catch on to the sign. Now, we are so constituted by nature that there are many signs we just catch on to just like that. So much so that we aren't even aware that this is an action of signs. It just seems like I live in my physical environment and I can deal with it. I can walk around and not run into things. Isn't that amazing? Right? If I'm hungry, I can reach for the attractive piece of food. I mean, we don't think of that as an action of science, even though it is.
Mm.
So when you really come to consider what's going on and what's happening when we try to understand reality, or perhaps are despairing of understanding it, it turns out that a sign, if there is such a thing as a sign or a sign relationship, which I think, of course, there is, that the study of signs is not something that can pertain simply to mind or to the world as divorced from mind, but it is the very thing that weds up those two, that marries them, that shows how they are not in this kind of dualistic separation, which can tempt you to throw either one away because you simply can't deal with a world that has that kind of radical rupture in it between mind and world. You're either going to become a materialist, which is a certain kind of dualist, that is, the cut is already made for you between mind and world. You simply decide that mind is a kind of illusory reality or an epiphenomenon, something that is not really real. It's just a kind of subjective byproduct of energy transfers between neurons or something. Or you're going to become like an absolute idealist or something beyond that, maybe like a Berkeleyan or something, where you decide that mind is, after all, what reality is. And if anything is illusory, it's matter. It's what we call the material. But maybe you don't have to make this choice. And maybe you can begin to understand understanding in a way that admits the whole of our experience into the account of things in some way. That we don't have to simply say, well, as people very often do, well, science, that's about facts and truth. That's kind of where the knowledge of reality is at. And everything else is human subjectivity. Walker Percy, one of my favorite authors, loves to make this kind of point that, the poor humanities, are kind of relegated to the realm of pleasing fictions, hopes and dreams and whatever else we like to entertain. But, when you get down to the sort of hardcore reality, it's what science gives us. So I think that semiotics has this capacity, call it an arm of philosophy or coextensive with philosophy. I mean, my belief is that I'm going to go out on a limb, that if human philosophizing has a future, and that's a question, I would want to sit down a lot of busy philosophical colleagues and say, hey, do you think philosophy actually has a future? And can you sketch it? I mean, a constructive future, not just that we just sort of keep on keeping on. I think it can. But I think that, and here's where I'm going to go out on a limb, that if human philosophizing has a future, semiotics is going to be central to that future. Every philosopher must become a semiotician. I'm not saying that's all they need to be. Far from it. There are other studies than the study of signs as signs, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think that philosophy has been in a hole for some time, and it kind of needs to get out of it, and it doesn't seem like it can get out of it. There are resources from an earlier tradition, but they have to be brought forward, and in a new way, I think. And semiotics is a big part of that new way.
I mean, obviously, I'm in agreement with that. But,
I didn't think you'd be breaking the coal. Exactly.
You use the word in the context of your answer there that always resonates with how I think about modern philosophy and the trajectory which has been undergone since the time of Bacon and Descartes, which is that modern philosophy is a trajectory of one divorce after another. You divorce mind from matter. You divorce culture from nature. You divorce truth from good, and you end up with this very fragmentary intellectual landscape where everything's just sort of these separate, unrelated chunks of being. To steal a phrase of the great semiotician Charles Peirce, that you're just sort of always making all of your analyses with an axe. I love that image
Yeah.
that he uses there. And I think this should be of obvious concern to people in the world today. We do live in a very fragmentary time. We live in a time where we find all of these seemingly irreconcilable oppositions between the different elements or objects of our experience. And it does seem to me, and I believe you just voiced an agreement, that semiotics is a way to not to bring them back together artificially, but to discover
Yeah.
their already extant underlying unity in the first place, and have a means of articulating it. And so, to sort of move the conversation forward a little bit, looking at one of those principal divorces that we're wrestling with today, the sciences and the humanities. Um, you know, Given your own background as someone who's worked in sciences and technology and has this Caltech background, but also an interest in and a pursuit and a doctorate in philosophy, as well as semiotics. Um, what relations do you find? What is the unity? How do we discover and articulate the unity between science and philosophy, or science and the humanities today? Not to ask, too easy of a question
Yeah.
for you there.
No, no, no. I'm going to have to kind of nibble away at this one a little bit. Well, in my view, both science and, if we could maybe stick at the first, to science and philosophy, um, both of which I consider to be refined ways of learning from experience. So I think on the natural level, at least, there's no other way to learn anything than through experience. I think I made the statement, or a statement like it, that all of our conscious life is an action of signs. Um, um, and, you know, signs are at the heart of both the scientific way of knowing, of investigating, and any other way of investigating, the philosophical, for instance. Um, all of our conscious life, this is what I think I said, is an action of signs. And what matters is what kinds of signs you pay attention to, what kind of signs you don't pay attention to. That's what accounts for whatever it is we do discover or fail to discover. Um, to be immersed in the world is to be immersed in signs. All human learning and discovery in ordinary life, in the sciences, and in the arts takes place through the actions of the various kinds of signs that bathe us in experience. Now, the sciences, one of their great strengths of what we call science today is that there is a methodological framework for the rigorous testing of hypotheses. Um, and it is characteristic of that framework that it also limits the kind of hypotheses that can be admitted. In the foreground is what I would call the compulsive kind of causality. Um, how things are brought about through, say, the interchange of energy in the physical sense, mechanical, chemical, and so forth. And I may make a few people that I know a little bit upset when I say this, but although someone like Galileo or Descartes really sincerely thought that they were advancing the philosophy of nature, conceived that what they were doing was in continuity with what had been done. It was the same kind of inquiry. In fact, they ended up inaugurating something new, because science, the sciences, we call the hard sciences, right, by the method that is proper to them, do not really aim per se at the understanding of reality. What they aim at is control. And I mean control in the most benign and beneficent sense, for the sake of the betterment of human life. That was, in fact, the project, I think, of Descartes and Bacon. Now, and how? Why do I say that? Why do I say it's not about the understanding of reality? Because scientific method is resolved. It terminates ultimately in the discovery or the observation of new facts that confirm a hypothesis and enable the prediction of phenomena, and hence the possibility of the control of phenomena. So it comes to rest, if you will, in that observation of new facts. And new facts are always being accumulated. Now you're going to say, well, the confirmed hypothesis, the theory, if you will, surely reflects some kind of new understanding of reality. Well, as a side effect, in the soul of the scientist, who as a human being knows how to ask other kinds of questions than the questions that are directly answered in the laboratory, in the soul of the scientist, the theory may indeed prompt reflections, ruminations on how reality itself is constituted. But that is above and beside what the method as such gives you. Now, I know many scientists. I'm trained as one. I know that a scientist, if he's a true scientist, he or she's a true scientist, has a thirst for that kind of inquiry that you and I would call philosophical. Right? The kind of analysis, inquiry that is resolved not in the discovery of new facts that confirm a predictive theory or a theory that enables prediction, but an inquiry that's resolved in intelligible being, in the uncovering of ultimate categories, ultimate kinds of influence that are co-constitutive of the real, first principles of being. All right, that's the properly philosophical inquiry, and I think that the spirit of the scientist, the spirit of the true scientist has a thirst for that. But many scientists, I think, lack the intellectual tools to pursue that. And if there's a kind of cause or a project that's close to my heart, one of them that's close to my heart is helping them to do that. Because I have come from that world, and in some sense still inhabit it. Maybe along the way there I've conveyed something about how I see the relationship between science and philosophy. But I would, in terms of the arts, does the novel teach us anything about reality? I sure think so. I mean, so again, it's a question. If we can gain the fuller and fuller grasp we have of what the sign is. When I say the sign, I'm speaking about something that is evidently part of the architecture of things, as I said. And it's not just a question of what a sign is. Not something that signification is something that happens in your head. It happens between you and something that is informing you, that is bestowing a form on you, is mediating something to you. If we can get a handle upon that and upon what it is about reality that makes signification possible in the first place, then perhaps the humanities and the arts can again, and again I'm cribbing Walker Percy, take their place alongside the sciences as another kind of um, science, if you will, of the human being and of the meaning of meaning and of the sources of meaning. The reasons why nature does not act at random. Whatever it is about reality that makes the sign possible, and don't forget, if signification is not possible, then nothing that we call our knowledge is possible. If signification is possible, whatever it is about reality that makes it possible, it is something more than brute force and chance.
Yes, and I think to comment on that last point, it's the predominant object inquired after by the so-called hard sciences are those forces, those brute forces, those mechanical forces. They have this methodology which is quite expert at detecting those, but is entirely inexpert at detecting aught else, which makes me think of one of the great quotes of...
But if you understand the laws of force, if you understand the laws of compulsion, what you can then do is compel nature for your own purposes.
Well, yes, and that's very attractive, of course.
Yeah.
Who doesn't enjoy compelling nature for its own purposes?
Yeah. And again, I'm not considering the shadow side here. I don't even want to consider the shadow side at the moment because, I'm in love with the sciences, and not merely as a mechanism of control, all right, because they do indirectly disclose much that a philosopher, someone who is interested in the constitution of reality as such, has to pay attention to. So, philosophy uses all the data, right? But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. What you were complete your thought.
Well, I was thinking, as one cannot but do in the context of discussing signs, of Charles Peirce, where he makes the claim that poets are much better observers of reality than scientists are, except for the special minutiae at which the scientists are looking, or for which they are looking. But and I think to your point, that lattermost point, those special minutiae can change how we understand so much. And we can't simply write them off and sort of dismiss them as irrelevant, tiny facts. Those tiny facts can, you think about quantum physics, right? Those are the tiniest of facts in some ways, right? And yet so profoundly impactful on our understanding of what is. Even if we don't know for certain the truth or falsity of things theorized by the quantum physicists as yet. But I think this draws it forward a little bit into just sort of thinking about how we go about getting our education in the first place. What are the means and the methods? What are the how do we even balance out that sort of distinction in our education and in our instruction? It seems that and this is perhaps one of the greatest difficulties we've encountered with respect to the advance of science and the maintenance and perhaps recovery of a philosophical purview, because the specialization which is demanded in the sciences seems to perhaps preclude the pursuit of the broader education necessary to develop those intellectual tools. So, I think about this as well in the context of the Lyceum and what we're trying to do with this institute, is to provide this environment of continual learning. I wonder if you have maybe a few thoughts, perhaps, on the differences in how we go about studying these things. Is there a fundamental difference just even in how we read different texts or study different materials between looking for the kind of instruction which is perhaps more central to a pursuit of science and the kind of instruction which is more characteristic of reading and philosophy and the humanities?
Let me just first comment regarding the Lyceum, picking up what you picking up something that you dropped there, it's striking to me when I look at, when I consider the people that I've met through the Lyceum that have been my students in my seminars. Many of them, more than perhaps one would naively expect, come from scientific and engineering backgrounds. That is, they have that sense that their appetite has been whetted, but that they don't have the tools to pursue questions in that broader context. And so it's always striking to me that just how many of those people we have at the Lyceum. Reading. Well, so when you read, you can read in quest of information or instruction, in which case you're reading really with a particular goal in mind, a practical goal. You're trying to understand how you're going to solve the problems at the end of the chapter. If it's a scientific text, or at any rate, there is some practical domain of practical problems, and you're reading for instruction on what is necessary to know to solve a particular kind of problem. So in a way, when you're reading the meaning, the signification of the information that you read may turn out to be surprising in certain ways, maybe especially difficult to grasp in certain ways, but in a certain sense, its ultimate meaning for you is kind of pre-known, kind of pre-understood in terms of this particular practical domain in which this knowledge is relevant. And this knowledge is true knowledge. I need those scare quotes put it, but when you read for information, I think it's bounded. The possible meaning for you, as long as that's what you're reading for, is bounded by what this information is going to be serviceable for. But when you read for, let's call it reading for understanding, reading a philosophical text, or not just a philosophical text, because I think that when I read a novel, when I read Tolkien, what's happening is something a little different. There's no kind of pre-understood bounds of the problem that I'm trying to solve. When I read, I may pick up a particular book of philosophy because I have a certain kind of question in mind, but that's just because picking up this particular book of philosophy is part of a whole journey that I am on. Whenever I read a text like that, or whenever I read for this kind of understanding, I am continuously retraversing or rereading really the whole of my experience in light of what I'm reading now. Mm-hmm. So it's not a kind of linear pursuit of a solution to a problem or a set of problems, but it's rather an effort to grasp how I am situated, how my life is situated within this larger mysterious reality of which I am part. And so you often speak of philosophy, the study of philosophy, as recursive in this sense, that it always involves a recursing over experience, a recursing over what we take to over previously understood things that we have never fully grasped, because our grasp is always because what the sign signifies is always greater than the sign. One of our masters, John Poinsot, say that the disclosure is never complete, but it becomes greater the more we experience, the more signs we are affected by, the more we live, the more we go through. Whenever we go through these significant junctures in life, particularly when we're touched by death, or when we're touched by falling in love, or anything that kind of changes us begins to change us in this deep way, that change has to begin unfolding, and it will go on unfolding indefinitely. Mm-hmm. And what these texts help us do is bring us into a different kind of community with fellow travelers, in which our understanding progressively deepens. It's not an accumulation of more and more information, but it's a greater penetration of those signs that have continually affected us, that have disclosed to us something. But now we go back, we got back over it under the stimulus of what we're reading, and we discover a further illumination.
Yeah, what you say there makes me think, actually. I've just been doing some of my own continued reading in semiotics of some of how Umberto Eco talks about texts. And he makes this distinction between a closed text and an open text. And a closed text is one that you can impose different interpretations on it, but it's very much, it's this or it's this, and it's either one or the other. Whereas an open text always has this developmental aspect to it. It's never finite, it's never closed off, and that you, the reader, in some way participate in the constitution of that text's meaning. So it's not only that you find your own life continually unfolded by this and sort of recursively resolved in some way, but you participate in the advance of meaning for others as well. That you can see in a great text meanings that the author did not explicitly intend himself that are true. Right. That there's something there beyond, something signified beyond what the signs contain, strictly in themselves. They bring us into something more and something more open.
Yeah.
And this
is why, when we talk about semiotics, sometimes when I talk with people about semiotics, I see them kind of getting nervous and shifting around in their chairs because they feel that some kind of awful relativism is standing at the door. When I speak about the twofold relativity of the sign, that there is something of the interpreter in every sign, but it's not really so. All right. We are not simply in control of the sign, and the first signs we encounter are not those we construct. And when we do construct them, we are leveraging, I hate that kind of business word, but we are leveraging what those signs are of themselves, those natural signs are of themselves capable of signifying. Mm-hmm. And so we can never completely bring that under our control and commandeer meaning for ourselves. And this is why, yes, the meaning of a sign, like a literary sign, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, is something that is going to grow indefinitely. You can't simply draw a circle around it and say, okay, this is what it means. We have now expressed it. It's done. We can move on. Maybe you can do that with a great physics textbook like Halliday and Resnick. But I don't think you can do that with other kinds of texts that Eco calls the open texts. And that's precisely because the sign is itself so powerful, so potentially able to disclose the meaning that even the author, the human author that takes up these signs, puts them together, does not grasp the, quote, whole meaning of his own work, ever. But that meaning is something that will just continuously grow as people encounter reality through those signs.
Yeah, and that seems to be one of the great fruits, I would say, of taking a proper and rich semiotic understanding of language and texts to the intellectual life, uh, is that it really seems to facilitate this habit of continual inquiry, this habit of, wait, what else can this mean? How else can I understand this? What other things can this show to me? Without it being, this relativistic, sort of laissez-faire, decide the meaning, choose your own adventure, right?
Yeah.
Even choose your own adventure texts are pretty delimited, right? There's only so many pages that tells you to turn to. So yeah, I think that's a really fascinating, connection of different ideas there and different thoughts. Yeah, and maybe we'll sort of we'll bring it to a close here because we're already stretching the bounds of time that are available to both of us probably. So I kind of just want to move to the last question, and this is just as the first question is what I'm asking to all faculty, so to the last. If you could isolate as best as possible one thing, one lesson that you would hope your students take away from encounter of you as a teacher, what would it be? Again, not to throw you too many easy questions, but yeah.
I would hope that in reading things together with me, we would discover together this unlimited potential of these signs that we encountered. I had one of my greatest teachers, my own greatest teachers, was priest Father Owen Carroll, who I used to read texts with, and he really ushered the students that were receptive, at least, into this way of just reading down into a text, uncovering layers of signification, discovering that ideas are not like atoms, or like the way we conceive of atoms. An idea is just this little circle that's clear and distinct, as Descartes might put it, and just sort of this self-understood intelligibility. But that ideas are something that the world is far stranger than that. That ideas, as Charles Peirce would say, they flow into each other. And what flows into the ideas is an inexhaustible reality. An idea is just a kind of sign. It's the sign that is engendered in us when we are interpreting the signs that affect us outwardly. And they're living things. Peirce would say, and being alive, they grow. Meaning grows. And we are drawn, the more we kind of slow down and recollect and become contemplatives, at least on a natural level, become contemplatives, the more we experience this unfolding of meaning through the encounter with the signs of Aquinas or Plato or someone who or other great teachers who are midwives, as somebody said. I think it was Plato. The teacher doesn't pour knowledge into students like a liquid. The teacher helps the student get into that position from which they can catch on. They can begin to catch on to signs. And then their journey begins, and the signs develop within them, their meaning.
Yeah. So the lesson is that you can't isolate one thing to take away.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. The life of the mind is goes on and on. It never truly ends. Well, thank you so much, Kirk, for joining me. I hope everyone's gotten better to know you through this interview, and you've shown a little bit more of what we're about at the Lyceum. So thank you. Take care.
Pleasure talking with you as
Talk to you
always.
soon.